Last week, we didn't study together because I was in Saudi Arabia. When I was in Saudi Arabia, I was in what's called northern Saudi Arabia, where I was visiting, looking for Har Sinai. And when I got to Har Sinai, I wrote parts of the Torah. And then we come back this week, and here we see the first verse says, Vaydaber Hashem al Moshe b'Har Sinai limor. God spoke to Moses at Mount Sinai saying, and that's the law of Shemitah, the sabbatical year, which is the idea that every seventh year we're not allowed to work the land. We have to only harvest what we can eat, and we're not allowed to sell it or not allowed to make money off of the sabbatical year. So when I was in Saudi Arabia, I had the good fortune to go with the Bedouin guides and with the professor of Bible, and to look through different mountains and to try to determine which one was Har Sinai. And we start off by going down to the coast of the Red Sea. I immersed in the coast because it would be a mikvah before I wrote the Torah. And from there, we went the first day to Jebel Harb. And we camped out at Jebel Harb. We slept there that night. We prayed at sunrise. We studied Torah through the night, taught some Torah on Zoom to the world, from Mount Sinai. And then the next day we went to Jebel Al-Lauz, Jebel Makla. Jebel Lauz and Jebel Makla are really right next to each other, so it's really one area. So those mountains are much bigger than Jebel Harb, and most of the world thinks that those mountains, that one of them is Mount Sinai. The further evidence for that is that there's a lot of archaeological evidence around those mountains which seem to support it being a place of worship. So there are altars there, and there's also a lot of drawings on the sides, across from those mountains, weird drawings that look like a calf. The ancient, we don't even know when these drawings were made actually, but there are drawings, ancient drawings that look like a calf. So also it's a much more majestic mountain, both of those mountains. There's some evidence that there's a cave on there, which we know that Elijah the prophet went back to the Mount Sinai. Excuse me. You know that Elijah the prophet went back to Mount Sinai and stayed in a cave. So that's why some people, I guess most Christian scholars argue that Jebel Makla and Jebel Lauz are the real Har Sinai. And also while I was there, when we were standing on Jebel Makla and Jebel Lauz, we actually met a man from Chicago. He lives in Skokie now, but he's originally from Kirkuk, and his first language is Aramaic. So we spoke to him in Aramaic. He's not Jewish, he's Christian, and we spoke to him in Aramaic. That was nice. He was the only tourist we saw the entire time. The only other tourist we saw the entire time we're in Saudi Arabia. But Jebel Harb is a mountain that Rabbi Alexander Hull, in his book, Searching for Sinai, it's the mountain that he argues is Har Sinai. And his argument was very appealing to me that this is the real Har Sinai, because it seems to fit better with rabbinic midrashim. First of all, and we'll see in a moment, I'm going to share with you a source from the Maharal. Har Sinai, in the Jewish tradition, is not the tallest mountain. That, like Jebel Makla and Jebel Lauz, are these majestic mountains. Jebel Harb is not, it does have one unusual feature, but its unusual feature is not its height. So that is actually more consistent with the rabbinic tradition. And what to me was so interesting about Jebel Harb is that the Gemara in Shabbos 88 tells us that when the Jewish people stood at Mount Sinai, God held the mountain over their heads like a barrel. Now, if you look at Jebel Harb, there is a very weird top to the mountain. It looks like this, and then it goes up like a barrel. It actually does look like a barrel being held over their heads, and it also has a cave. So it's possible that that's where the rabbinic midrash's origin came from this very unusual cover or peak to the mountain. So, but we wrote the Torah in both places to hedge our bets, and really, you can't. The only thing the Gemara tells us about Har Sinai, aside from the fact that it was not the tallest of all the mountains, that there was one rabbi who went looking for it in Baba Basra, Ayin Daled, and he was told by an Arab that Har Sinai was scorpions that are as high as white donkeys. We did actually see some scorpions on Jebel Harb. We carried a desk up the mountain on a camel, and then we put the desk down and we wrote on the Torah there, and then we walked around the mountain, and under some of the rocks there were a couple of scorpions. There's not too much that's alive in that area. I mean, it's basically, maybe I saw one bird. I mean, it's not a tremendous place of life. So that's just a little bit about my trip, just a little bit where we were standing looking for Mount Sinai. Then we open up our parsha this week, and our parsha this week is all about Har Sinai. So let me just pause for a second. If anybody has any questions, I'll just pause. If I see any hands up, okay, no hands up. All right, we'll continue. So the portion this week tells us God spoke to Moses at Mount Sinai. Now, why is it? And God tells Moshe about the laws of the sabbatical year. Now we look at Mount Sinai. Now we look at the first Rashi. Rashi says, "Ma inyan shmita etz Har Sinai." Why do we have to specify? There are two things that are specified. There's the 10 Commandments was given at Mount Sinai, and then there's these laws of the sabbatical year. Well, why do we have to say that the sabbatical year specifically was given at Mount Sinai? Rashi says, "Well, kol mitzvot nemru miSinai." Weren't all the commandments given at Sinai? To tell us, says Rashi, "El ma shmita nemru kol osel pratosel v'tiktukeh miSinai." Just like the sabbatical year was said with its general rules and all its details, and all the finer points were stated at Sinai. Av kulan nemru kol osel v'tiktukeh miSinai. So too, all of the laws were stated in their general rules and their principles at Sinai. So Rashi is saying that it says, why does it say Shemitah at Har Sinai? To teach us that just like all the laws were set at Sinai, just like Shemitah was set with all the specifics and general rules at Sinai, so too everything was set at Sinai. Rashi actually is siding with one opinion in the Gemara, because the day we came back from Har Sinai, the Gemara in Sota 37 tells us about a dispute between Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva. What exactly was taught at Har Sinai? Rabbi Yishmael said just the general parts of the mitzvot were taught at Sinai, but not all the specifics. And Rabbi Akiva said the general and the specifics were taught at Sinai. But Rashi here is siding with the position of Rabbi Akiva and against Rabbi Yishmael. But Rabbi Yishmael is very clear that not all the details of the laws were set at Sinai. So this is a little background between, I found 6 explanations amongst the commentaries, which I want to share with everybody, as to why specifically the Shemitah law is singled out for being taught at Har Sinai. Because Rashi's answer doesn't explain why is Shemitah specifically the one that the Torah tells us was taught at Har Sinai. All of them should have been taught. I mean, why specifically Shemitah? Why is Shemitah the paradigm of the laws taught at Har Sinai? So therefore, I have 6 different answers to share with you about that. Before we get to them, I want to see if anybody has any questions. I'll stop the recording. Okay. So first answer I'd like to suggest to you as to why Shemitah is specifically set at Mount Sinai. It's a very powerful answer. This is the answer that's brought in the source called Kometz HaMincha U'Maharal Charif. He said, what's the understanding of the mitzvah of Shemitah? L'hashrish b'toch ha'ovavot et ha'akara, to place, to root into the hearts the recognition sha'olam ha'shafel, that the lower world, is natun tadir tachat hashgachato shel Hashem yitbarach, that the lower world is always under the dominion of God, and from God comes its influence. And the purpose of the Shemitah year is to ferret out from underneath the minds of the heretics who claim that it's inappropriate. It's not appropriate to imagine that the King of Kings who rules over the heavens should be involved in this measly physical world. Rather, the heretics claim that God's not involved. So says the Kometz HaMincha U'Maharal Charif, he says, that is what Shemitah is telling us. In this place of greatness, there is his humility. Meaning to say that Hashem is promising us that he's going to provide for us. And this is the source. That's what Shemitah is saying. And here's the phrase I want to tell you, this paragraph. The greatest proof of this is that Hashem chose to be the mountain where Hashem gave the Torah. Sinai. God chose the smallest of all the mountains, Sinai. Now, it's not the smallest mountain ever, but it is the smallest mountain in that area. So, to reveal his divine presence and to give his Torah. And that's what this is demonstrating to us. That even though God is so great and exalted, he loves the humble. So therefore, that's what this Kometz HaMincha U'Maharal Charif writes. Hashra'at HaShechina al Har Sinai, the resting of the divine presence at Mount Sinai, is the Raya HaBrura, is the clearest proof for the mitzvah of Shemitah, that it's coming to teach us that God rules over the lower world. So the fact, that's the connection between Shemitah and Har Sinai. That the purpose of Shemitah is to demonstrate to us that we're not in charge of the world, God runs the world. And Mount Sinai, and then people argue, it can't be that God runs the world. Why would God, the all-knowing, get involved in the roll up God's elbows, so to speak, roll up the sleeves and get involved in the world below? Mount Sinai proves that, because God chose to give the Torah on Mount Sinai, which is the place, the most humble of all the mountains. I want to say that I felt that presence when I stood at Har Sinai, which is, by the way, a completely pristine location to this day. Har Sinai today, you get the feeling looks exactly like it did 3,500 years ago. That's Jebel Harb. But Jebel Lauz and Jebel Makla, they are not long for this world, because Jebel Lauz and Makla are on the outskirts of this billions of dollar city that the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia is building. It's called Neom. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of it. So they're going to basically interfere with the pristine, they've already interfered with the pristine beauty of the other two mountains. But Jebel Harb looks exactly the way it looked when Moshe Rabbeinu was standing there. Okay, let me just pause for a second in case anybody has any questions.